Okay, so imagine for a second that a farmer wants to plow a field in the old-fashioned way. So he's got a couple of oxen, I think is the plural of ox, right? He's got a couple of oxen, and he's got a yoke on them, and that yoke ultimately goes back through a chain to a big plow, okay? Now imagine one of the oxen is really big and buff, and the other one's tiny and skinny. How easy do you think it's going to be for those two oxen that are very unequally matched to drive a straight line, to plow a straight line? Well, hey everyone, I'm Craig Smith, and I love trying to give meaningful answers to people's tough questions about God, the Bible, following Jesus, the church, all those kinds of things. Today we're going to tackle the question, should a Christian marry a non-Christian? All right, so there's a little bit of a diversity of opinion among this. If you look at Bible scholars and Bible teachers, you're going to see that there is a little bit of a range in terms of how people answer. There are some people who think that it's absolutely a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian, and then there's some people who think that it's just a really bad idea. So technically a spectrum, but nobody thinks that it's a good idea. Now, one of the most common places in the Bible that people go to find out what God has to say about a believer marrying a non-believer is 2 Corinthians 6:14, where Paul writes kind of an interesting statement. He says that a believer, he says, do not be unequally yoked with a non-believer. So a believer should not be unequally yoked with a non-believer. Now, a couple things. First off, it's probably important to recognize that that verse isn't specifically talking about marriage. It's actually talking about any kind of substantial entanglement that a Christian has with a non-Christian. So that could include business relationships and other things as well. It's not just marriage, but marriage is certainly a partnership, an entanglement, we might say, of the highest order. And so I think it certainly applies to Christians. And so we have a pretty clear statement there that a believer should not be unequally yoked with a non-believer. Now, I would actually, before I really dig into that verse much and what it means to be yoked, I would actually take a step back and go back to the book of Genesis chapter 2 in particular, which is where God talks about marriage itself. I mean, God invented marriage, and in Genesis 2 we see God institute marriage. And it's pretty clear when God invented and instituted marriage that the purpose of marriage was to allow the man and the woman to accomplish God's purposes in the world through them. It was to allow God's purposes to be accomplished in the world through the husband and the wife. So we all have a purpose. We were all made actually to represent God and to extend His influence in the world. And as followers of Jesus, we reclaim that mission for which we were originally made. And so every follower of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, you have this mission, which is to extend God's influence everywhere in the world that you have influence. But that's not an easy thing to do. There's all kinds of things working against it. And so one of the things that happens in marriage is the husband and the wife actually sharpen each other, and they support each other, and they encourage each other, and they equip each other, and all those things that are necessary so that the man and the woman both can be fulfilling God's purpose of extending His influence in the world through them. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus and you recognize that mission, and you marry somebody who's not a follower of Jesus, number one, they're not going to recognize God's authority over them. And so they're certainly not going to recognize God's mission, His purpose, His plan for them. And so they're not going to be doing that, and they're certainly not going to be supporting you in doing it. So what's going to happen is when a Christian marries a non-Christian, that mission is going to go off track. It's going to go off target. By the way, that 2 Corinthians passage says, do not be unequally yoked. That's weird language, I said earlier. And the reason I said it's unusual or weird language is because yoked means this kind of wooden thing that was put on the backs of two oxen in the ancient world when they were plowing a field. And the idea there about not being unequally yoked is he's saying, hey, don't put a really kind of big buff oxen in the yoke with a really small, skinny one, not very muscular one. And the idea was what's going to happen is the big, buff, muscular one is going to pull harder, and he's going to go off in a different direction. And that's the idea that when a believer marries a non-believer, they're not going to be moving in the same direction. And a lot of times I think Christians think, well, my faith is strong, so I'll bring them along. But the reality is, even if your faith is incredibly strong, when you're not pulling side by side with somebody who shares that faith, you're going to end up going in a direction that wasn't your original intention. You're going to go off track. And so marrying a non-Christian as a Christian, it's not something you want to get engaged in, because you want to be able to experience everything that God has for you in your life. And that's going to be incredibly difficult. And it's always going to be lessened by being involved in a marriage relationship with somebody who does not share your faith in Jesus. Okay, follow-up question, right? So what if it's not that they don't have a faith in Jesus like you do? What if they're just really young, or they're very immature, or they don't have as strong a faith, or whatever, that kind of a thing? I think actually we're going to go back to the same place with that unequally yoked idea. Because again, if you get the big burly ox and the small skinny ox, they're not going to be able to pull evenly, and so what's going to happen is you're going to end up going off track. You're not going to be able to stay straight on the course that God has called you to. Now, the other thing that happens, I think, a lot of times is people who have a mature faith go, well, I'll bring them up with me. And I'm not going to lie, sometimes that does happen. But in my experience, that's been the exception to the rule. More often than not, what happens is the mature Christian is kind of brought down to the level of the immature one. And so, again, because what's happening is everyone sort of seeks a kind of stasis or a kind of balance. And it's probably harder to pull someone along than it is to pull you back. And so the reality is, if you marry a very immature believer, one who's a lot more immature than you, the chances are pretty good they're actually going to dim your light rather than you brightening theirs. So again, not a great idea.